What if the ground beneath your feet, the very soil that fed your ancestors, was no longer yours to walk upon? For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not a philosophical question. It was a cold, suffocating reality. For over a decade, a shadow had been stretching across the Sahel, a darkness composed of silent roads and abandoned villages. At 5 in the morning, on a day that felt like any other, an elderly farmer in the northern province stood by his gate. He folded his last clean shirt 3 times. Then he picked it up again. He did not know where he was going, only that the sound of motorcycles in the distance meant his time in his ancestral home had ended. They called it a global effort to maintain security. But the records show a different story. They show a nation rich in gold and spirit, yet bleeding from 1,000 cuts, whilst the world watched from air-conditioned offices in distant capitals, until a young captain named Ibrahim Traore refused to accept the inevitable. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this resonates, show your support with a like, comment, or subscription. It keeps the story alive. This is not just about a change in military leadership. It is about the fundamental right to exist without permission from a foreign power. For years, the narrative of West Africa was written in ink that did not belong to its people. We were told that the insurgency was too complex, the terrain too vast, and the local forces too weak. Yet, look closely at the streets of Ouagadougou. Look at the eyes of the youth who have grown tired of mourning. When Ibrahim Traore took the stage, he did not arrive with the polished rhetoric of a career politician. He arrived in faded camouflage, carrying the dust of the front lines on his boots. His voice was not one of a conqueror, but of a man who had seen his brothers fall in the tall grass of the Sahel and decided that enough was enough. The crisis did not appear overnight. To understand the rise of Ibrahim Traore, one must understand the systematic failure that preceded him. Since the year 2015, Burkina Faso had been pushed into a corner. Imagine a territory where 2/5 of the land is no longer under state control. Imagine schools where the blackboards are covered in dust because teachers fled for their lives. The trigger was not a single event, but a series of betrayals. The previous administration sat in gilded halls whilst the countryside burned. Soldiers were sent into the bush with 30-year-old rifles and limited ammunition, expected to fight an enemy that was better equipped and more mobile. It was a tragedy of neglect. The numbers tell a harrowing tale. Over 2 million people were displaced within their own borders. That is 1 in every 10 citizens forced to leave their dreams behind in a plastic bag. The bakery that had served a community for 40 years now has boards on the windows. The sign above the door still says, "See you tomorrow." But tomorrow never came for the thousands who perished in the silence of the savannah. This was the landscape of despair that greeted the young captain. He saw the gap between the official reports and the bloody reality of the trenches. The records in the capital spoke of progress, but the graveyards in the north spoke of a different truth. A pivotal moment occurred in late September 2022. The air in the capital was thick with the scent of rain and resentment. A convoy carrying essential supplies to the besieged town of Djibo was decimated. It was not just the loss of life, it was the loss of hope. The soldiers saw that their leaders were more concerned with diplomatic etiquette than with the survival of the rank and file. It was in this vacuum of leadership that the junior officers, led by Ibrahim Traore, made a choice. They did not seek power for the sake of a throne. They sought it because they knew that every day of hesitation cost another dozen lives. The arrival of Ibrahim Traore changed the geometry of power in West Africa. He did not look toward the traditional centers of influence in Europe for salvation. He knew that the old alliances had provided plenty of words, but very little security. There was a secret promise whispering through the corridors of the new administration, a promise that Burkina Faso would no longer fight with its hands tied behind its back. But what was this new path? It was whispered that a shipment was due to arrive at the international airport, something that did not bear the markings of the former colonial masters. Whilst the international community expressed concern about democratic norms, the people on the streets felt a different emotion: dignity. For the first time in decades, the leader of the country spoke their language, shared their meals, and understood their pain. He spoke of sovereignty as a living thing, not a dusty legal concept. He began to reorganize the defense of the nation from the ground up, calling upon the volunteers for the defense of the fatherland. Suddenly, the farmer who had fled his land was given a reason to look back. The youth who had been forgotten were given a uniform and a purpose. But as the new government began to consolidate its position, the pressure from the outside world intensified. Economic sanctions were threatened. Diplomatic invitations were rescinded. Yet, the young captain remained unmoved. He stood at the podium and reminded his people that it is better to die on one's feet than to live on one's knees. He was preparing a masterstroke, a shift in strategy that would leave the old powers reeling. He knew that to win a modern war, one needed eyes that never slept and hands that could strike from a distance of 20 kilometers without missing a centimeter. The records of the military handover were kept under tight wraps for months. There were rumors of Turkish engineers seen in the local markets and quiet test flights over the desert sands. The world was focused on the politics of the coup, but they missed the silent revolution in the hangars. A new era was dawning, one where the height of a drone's flight would determine the depth of a nation's freedom. What happened next changed everything. No one in the Western intelligence circles saw it coming. They expected another unstable transition, another leader who would eventually succumb to the lure of foreign aid and old habits. They did not expect a man who would trade the comfort of the palace for the grit of the command center. They did not expect the arrival of technology that would bridge the gap between a struggling army and a sophisticated insurgency. As the sun began to set over the red earth of Ouagadougou, a low hum could be heard in the sky. It was not the familiar rattle of a vintage helicopter. It was something smoother, more purposeful. The people looked up, shielding their eyes from the glare. They saw a silhouette that promised a different future. This wasn't just about military hardware. It was about the psychological reclaiming of the heavens. But as the dust settled on the runway after the first successful deployment, a question remained. How could a land with so little suddenly challenge so many? The answer lay not just in the machines, but in the iron will of a man who had decided that the history of his country would no longer be written in a foreign tongue. The loop was opening, and the world was forced to watch as Burkina Faso began to stand tall. The low hum vibrating through the dry air of the Sahel was the sound of a closing loop. For years, the soldiers of Burkina Faso had looked to the sky with a sense of abandonment. If a plane appeared, it was often a foreign craft, its mission dictated by interests far removed from the dusty reality of the local trenches. But under the leadership of Ibrahim Traore, the sky began to belong to the people once more. The arrival of the Bayraktar TB2 and the more formidable Akinci drones from Turkey was not merely a procurement of hardware, it was the closing of a cycle of dependency. These machines represented a new philosophy of sovereign technology. The young captain understood that to protect the borders of Burkina Faso, he needed eyes that did not require a foreign signature to open. Leave a thank you in the comments to Ibrahim Traore, or simply thank you for hope. Each thank you carries weight. Each says, I hear this, I stand with this. Write your thank you now. The Akinci is a giant of the air, possessing a wingspan of over 20 meters. To a veteran soldier who has spent 20 years carrying a heavy rifle through the scrubland, the sight of such a machine is almost miraculous. It can stay airborne for 24 hours, loitering at altitudes where the heat haze of the desert disappears into a thin, cold blue. This endurance is the micro payoff for a nation that has suffered from the tyranny of distance. In the past, by the time a ground unit reached the site of an ambush, the perpetrators had vanished into the vastness of the northern provinces. Now, the Akinci watches, it records, it remembers, it provides the persistent presence that a human heart no matter how brave, cannot sustain alone. The transition to this high-tech defense was not without its hurdles. It required a radical reimagining of what a Burkinabe soldier could be. In the quiet corners of training facilities, young men who had grown up in rural villages were suddenly tasked with mastering complex avionics and satellite communication links. These were the first engineers of a new era. Individuals who stayed up until 3 in the morning to study flight patterns and infrared signatures. They were not just learning to fly drones, they were learning to defend their dignity with mathematics and precision. One young technician, whose family had lost their cattle to an insurgent raid 3 years prior, spoke of the drone not as a weapon of war, but as a shield for the innocent. When he sits at the control console, he is not seeking vengeance, he is seeking the safety of the next village down the road. The strategic shift was profound. By choosing Turkey as a primary partner, Ibrahim Traore bypassed the layers of bureaucratic hesitation that often characterized Western defense aid. The Turkish model offered something the old powers could not: speed and a lack of colonial baggage. There were no lectures on political alignment, only a pragmatic exchange of technology for a nation in crisis. This allowed Burkina Faso to field an advanced aerial capability in a matter of months rather than years. The drones were quickly integrated into a multi-layered surveillance network that covered the most volatile regions. The results were immediate. Large groups of insurgents, who had previously operated with the confidence of ghosts, suddenly found that the shadows no longer offered protection. However, as the capabilities of the state grew, so did the list of those who viewed this independence with suspicion. There were shadows in the Sahel that even infrared could not pierce political shadows. Beyond the battlefield, a different kind of conflict was brewing. In the halls of international organizations and the embassies of neighboring states, the rise of a self-reliant Burkina Faso was seen by some as a dangerous precedent. If one nation could reclaim its skies and its gold without the permission of the traditional masters, what would stop others from doing the same? A list was being compiled, a roster of those who preferred the old status quo of managed instability over the new reality of African sovereignty. The Akinci drone carries a payload that includes laser-guided smart munitions capable of striking a target with a margin of error measured in centimeters. But the true power of the machine lies in its ability to prevent conflict through superior intelligence. By mapping illegal supply routes and identifying the hidden camps of the insurgency, the military could now preempt attacks before they began. This led to a significant decrease in the number of casualties among the volunteers for the defense of the fatherland. The farmer, who once feared the sound of a motorcycle, now looked at the sky and saw a guardian. This psychological shift is perhaps the greatest achievement of the Traore administration during this phase. As the second year of his leadership approached, the young captain made it clear that the drones were just the beginning. He spoke of a domestic industry, of a day when the parts for these machines would be forged in the furnaces of Ouagadougou. He was building more than a military, he was building a technical elite. But the paradox remained. The more successful Burkina Faso became at defending itself, the more isolated it seemed to become in the eyes of the global diplomatic elite. They questioned the cost of the drones, ignoring the far higher cost of the lives lost during the years of inaction. One particular mission in the northern border region stands out in the records. A large convoy of insurgents had gathered, planning a major assault on a mining site that provided essential revenue for the national budget. In years past, such an attack would have succeeded, resulting in the destruction of infrastructure and the loss of dozens of lives. This time, an Akinci loitering at 30,000 feet detected the movement hours in advance. The military did not rush in blindly. They watched, they waited, they understood the patterns. When the intervention finally came, it was swift and decisive. The threat was neutralized before a single civilian was put in danger. This success sent a clear message to the region. The era of the helpless state was over. Ibrahim Traore had demonstrated that even a landlocked nation with limited resources could achieve technological parity with its adversaries if the leadership possessed the necessary will. The drones became a symbol of this newfound strength, often featured in national broadcasts as a reminder of the country's resilience. Yet, the air remained thick with tension. The drones saw everything on the ground, but they could not see into the hearts of the men plotting in distant boardrooms. The paradox of the Sahel is that peace is often the most provocative act of all. By stabilizing the interior and reclaiming the gold mines, Burkina Faso was inadvertently challenging the economic structures that had kept the region in a state of perpetual poverty. The young captain was no longer just a soldier, he was a disruptor of a global system. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the runways of the air bases, the infrared cameras began to flicker to life. They were looking for enemies in the bush, but the real challenge was arriving in the form of diplomatic cables and economic ultimatums. The drones saw everything, but there were shadows in the Sahel that even infrared could not pierce. The question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could fight, but whether it would be allowed to win. The shift in Burkina Faso was not merely a change of equipment. It was a profound rupture in the geopolitical fabric of West Africa. For decades, the nation had been part of a structured reality where security was a product imported from Europe, often with invisible strings attached. Ibrahim Traore looked at these ancient ties and saw not a lifeline, but a leash. He understood that as long as the country relied on the approval of its former colonial masters, its sovereignty would remain a polite fiction. The decision to sever these ties was not an act of impulsive anger, but a calculated move to restore the dignity of a people who had been treated as secondary characters in their own history. The world watched in disbelief as the young captain politely but firmly asked foreign forces to depart. It was a moment of stark clarity. The era of the managed state was over. If this channel has moved you, consider becoming a member. Not for perks, but because supporting this directly supports narratives mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for Burkina Lead's mission. This pivot away from the traditional centers of power was met with predictable resistance. The narrative in the global press shifted almost overnight. Ibrahim Traore was no longer just a junior officer trying to save his country. He was framed as a destabilizing element. Yet on the ground, the reality felt entirely different. In the border towns where the tricolor of the old empire once flew, the red, green, and yellow of Burkina Faso now stood alone. This was the closing of the second loop, the end of the myth that African nations could not survive without a European guardian. The pressure was immense. Economic blocs threatened to close their borders, and financial institutions spoke of freezing assets. But Traore had already looked at the balance sheets. He knew that the gold beneath the soil of Burkina Faso was worth more than the digital numbers in a foreign bank. The most moving evidence of this new independence can be found in the northern villages. There is a small schoolhouse near the border that had been silent for 7 years. Its walls were pockmarked by bullets, and its playground was overgrown with thorns. Under the new security strategy, which combined drone surveillance with the grit of local volunteers, the shadows of the insurgency began to retreat. 3 months ago, the school bell rang for the first time since the year 2019. Instead of the sound of distant gunfire, the air was filled with the rhythmic chanting of children reciting their lessons. This is the climax of the Burkinabe spirit. Sovereignty is not found in the signature on a treaty. It is found in the ability of a child to read a book without looking over their shoulder in fear. This resurgence was fueled by a radical economic shift. Ibrahim Traore took a hard look at the mining sector, an industry that had historically seen the majority of its profits exit the country. He moved to ensure that the wealth generated from the earth stayed within the borders to fund the very drones and schools that were transforming the landscape. The image of Burkina Faso's gold no longer flowing to the vaults of Paris was a micro payoff that resonated across the entire continent. It was a signal to every other nation in the Sahel that the resources of Africa belonged to the Africans. This wasn't just about money, it was about the moral right to benefit from one's own inheritance. The young captain was effectively rewriting the economic laws of the region, proving that a nation can be poor in currency but rich in resolve. In the high-stakes rooms of global diplomacy, the Burkina Faso effect became a subject of intense debate. Analysts spoke of a spreading contagion of sovereignty. They feared that if Traore succeeded, the entire architecture of influence in West Africa would collapse. There were quiet conversations between powers that had not spoken in years, all focused on one question: how to contain the young man in the camouflage jacket. They tried to isolate him, but Traore responded by building a new alliance with his neighbors in Mali and Niger. Together, they formed a bloc of resistance, a coalition of the willing who chose the uncertainty of independence over the comfort of a golden cage. The records show that during this period, the attempts to undermine the administration only served to strengthen the bond between the leader and his people. The dignity of the nation was further bolstered by the way Traore handled international criticism. When told that his methods were unconventional, he replied that the suffering of his people was also unconventional. He refused to play the role of the humble petitioner. In one meeting with regional leaders, he reportedly sat in silence for 5 minutes, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in, before stating that he did not come to negotiate the survival of his country. This stoicism became his trademark. He was showing the world that respect is not something you ask for, it is something you command through your actions. As the third year of this revolutionary path unfolded, the results were undeniable. The military had reclaimed over 30% of the territory that had previously been lost. This was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. The volunteers for the defense of the fatherland, once a disparate group of poorly armed men, were now a disciplined force working in tandem with the latest aerial technology. The synergy between the ancient bravery of the spear and the modern precision of the drone was a sight to behold. It was a fusion of the old and the new, a synthesis of tradition and progress that defined the Traore era. But as the internal situation stabilized, the external threats became more sophisticated. It was no longer just about insurgents on motorcycles. It was about cyber attacks on infrastructure, sophisticated disinformation campaigns, and the quiet manipulation of commodity prices. The young captain knew that he had won the first few rounds, but the heavyweights were finally stepping into the ring. He stood at the command center in Ouagadougou, looking at a map of the Sahel. He saw the progress, but he also saw the gathering clouds. He had challenged the masters of the old world, and they were not known for their forgiveness. History is often written by the victors. But Ibrahim Traore was busy rewriting the present, transforming a narrative of victimhood into a story of agency. He had given his people a mirror in which they could see themselves as they truly were, a nation of warriors, builders, and dreamers. The path ahead was fraught with peril, and the forces aligned against him were formidable. But as he looked out over the red earth of his homeland, he knew that the spirit he had awakened could not be easily put back to sleep. The world was about to strike back, but for the first time in a century, Burkina Faso was ready to strike first. The struggle for Burkina Faso moved into a final, decisive phase where the battlefield was no longer just the dusty plains, but the very fabric of global systems. Ibrahim Traore stood at the center of a storm, facing a barrage of economic ultimatums and diplomatic freezes designed to bring the nation to its knees. Yet, the young captain did not flinch. He understood that these pressures were the final gasps of an old order that could not conceive of an African nation standing on its own 2 feet. To counter the sanctions, he turned inward, tapping into the immense resilience of the Burkinabe people. He encouraged local production, from textiles to food, ensuring that the country could feed itself whilst the world outside attempted to starve it of resources. It was a masterclass in domestic mobilization, proving that true independence is grown in the soil of self-reliance. Right where you're watching from, your city, your corner of the world, Burkina Led sends each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. The vision of Ibrahim Traore began to expand beyond the borders of a single nation. He looked at the shared history and shared suffering of his neighbors in Mali and Niger and saw the blueprint for a new future. Together, they laid the foundation for the Alliance of Sahel States, a confederation that sought to integrate their economies, their defenses, and their destinies. This was the birth of a new Africa, one that rejected the artificial boundaries drawn by colonial pens. In the markets of Ouagadougou, people spoke of a day when a single passport would allow them to travel from the edges of the Sahara to the banks of the Niger River. This wasn't just a political union, it was a psychological homecoming. For a family that had been divided by borders they never asked for, the prospect of returning to a unified homeland was a micro payoff of immense emotional weight. As the sun sets on this chapter of history, we see a nation transformed. The numbers speak of a recovery that many thought impossible. Tens of thousands of hectares of land have been returned to cultivation, and hundreds of schools have reopened their doors. A young mother who fled her village 3 years ago recently returned to find her home standing and her fields ready for harvest. She is not just a statistic of a successful military campaign, she is the living embodiment of a nation reclaiming its soul. Ibrahim Traore has shown that leadership is not about the length of one's title, but the depth of one's commitment to the people. He remains a man of the people, often seen without the pomp and pageantry of power, reminding everyone that he is, first and foremost, a soldier of the revolution. What you've just heard isn't simply history, it's a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive. If this moved you, subscribe. Not for numbers, but because we're building a space where voices of independence are honored. The legacy of this period will be measured not just in the territory reclaimed, but in the minds awakened. Ibrahim Traore has given a generation of Africans a reason to believe in themselves again. He has dismantled the myth of Western indispensability and replaced it with the reality of African agency. As we look toward the future, the risks remain high and the path is still narrow. The global powers will continue to test the resolve of the Sahel, looking for cracks in the alliance. But the foundation has been laid in stone and blood. The people of Burkina Faso have tasted the sweetness of dignity, and they will not easily return to the bitterness of subservience. They know that the journey is long, but they are no longer walking it in the dark. 1,000 soldiers might guard a border, but 1,000,000 hearts guard a revolution. And so, the story of Burkina Faso continues, written no longer in a foreign tongue, but in the bold, clear strokes of a people who have found their voice. You may not know the name of every village that was saved, but you will remember the feeling of a nation that refused to break. You may not remember the technical specifications of every drone that patrolled the sky, but you will feel the weight of the peace they helped to secure. What would you do in such a situation? Would you choose the safety of the status quo or the perilous journey toward true freedom? Subscribe, not just to stay informed, but to support the narrative of a continent that is finally standing tall. Ibrahim Traore is more than a leader. He is a symbol of a change that cannot be undone. In the heart of West Africa, the red earth of Burkina Faso remains a testament to the power of the human spirit. The sky is clear, the drones are watchful, and for the first time in a very long time, the morning belongs to those who wake up to build it. Ibrahim Traore and the people of Burkina Faso have shown us that even in the face of overwhelming